It was an emblematic declaration of Donald Trump's first term as US president. Trade wars, he said, are good and easy to win. On the basis of the first few weeks of his second term, this is not a subject on which President Trump's thinking has evolved. He has threatened bombardments of tariffs against assorted economic foes, including China, Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. As of this broadcast, ceasefires, though possibly only temporary, have been declared in two of these conflicts. Trump's tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico, and the retaliatory tariffs Canada and Mexico had promised against the United States, have been suspended for 30 days, after both Canada and Mexico solemnly promised to Trump that they would do things that they were pretty much doing anyway, thereby allowing Trump to claim a great victory. This much suggests that lessons were learned from Trump's previous stint in the White House about his signature style of government: cause chaos, stop causing chaos, take credit for the calm. But it does not suggest that Trump's enthusiasm for trade wars has waned. He is also threatening the EU with just such an onslaught, vexed by a trade deficit he describes as, quote, an atrocity. Although, judging by Trump's remarks on the subject, he thinks it is either $300 or $350 billion, not the $131 billion assessed by the actual Office of the United States Trade Representative, but what would they know? Are trade wars actually good and easy to win? Does the history of trade wars tell us anything about how to fight Trump's trade wars? And are Trump's trade wars really anything remarkable, or just part of a wider backlash against globalisation? This is the Foreign Desk.
From the conversations that I have, both with policymakers and investors, that is the effect: confusion and uncertainty. What's not clear is what the objective is.
The pig wars didn't start World War I, but they were part of the run-up to it.
So now it's not just about companies that may pose some sort of national security threat. It's about the entire economies of Canada, Mexico, China, and possibly the European Union. And who knows where else he will take us.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Tina Fordham, a geopolitical strategist and the founder of Fordham Global Foresight. Tina, let's start with a really basic question. How do tariffs actually work? Fundamentally, what are they, and how do you collect them once you've imposed them?
A tariff is basically a tax that a government imposes on goods and services that are coming across its borders from another country, and this is usually collected by customs authority upon arrival. So it's part of the kind of arsenal of economic measures that a government can employ.
I mean, to be clear, though, the tariffs, when they are imposed, are almost invariably passed on to the consumer, right? It makes the imported goods more expensive than they would have been.
Well, this is where governments like to be a little bit, cagey about how they see it. But that is the most common effect, that the producers of the goods will pass on the increased cost to the consumer.
We will come presently to President Donald Trump's impositions of tariffs or threats to impose tariffs, but when they are imposed by, let's say, to put it charitably, more orthodox leaders and more orthodox governments, what is the reason for doing it? Is it just to protect local industries, or are there other considerations?
There can be a number of considerations, but the term unorthodox and Donald Trump's interpretation of policies is really important to keep in mind. So what are the conditions where tariffs may be used? Perhaps a government wants to protect a fledgling industry that it wants to nurture. National security can be another reason. The reason why we're seeing so much uncertainty and confusion and consternation about what's coming from the second Trump term is it's not clear whether they want to use tariffs as a revenue generator. And sometimes Trump himself talks about this, the idea that extending tax cuts could be financed because of the revenue that he thinks would be brought in by tariffs. Or, as we see from most financial market participants, the idea that it's the equivalent of a big stick. It's a negotiating tool. And, we saw this over the weekend with threats on Colombia over its treatment migrants, or rather its refusal to accept migrants that it thought had been mistreated, and then threats on Canada and Mexico that were reversed or postponed, and then a tariff of 10% that was passed on China. What's not clear is what the objective is.
What's your read on how Trump has communicated these tariffs? Because obviously, like everything he pitches to his own support base, he says this will make your things cheaper, it will make your lives better. And that's probably not the case, at least in terms of making imported goods cheaper. Do you get the sense that Trump is rather hoping that his voters don't entirely understand how this works?
I wouldn't want to put myself in the position of trying to read Trump's mind. But it is consistent with what we've heard from some MAGA types like Steve Bannon talking about flooding the zone, creating chaos, uncertainty, even drama. A lot of what is coming out really appears to be designed to stoke maximum confusion and drama, only to then see these threatened 25% tariffs. That's a very significant increase on Canada and Mexico, postponed and reversed because of a concession that seems very tiny indeed, deploying troops along the borders in both cases. So it adds to the sense of confusion, difficulty in keeping up, uncertainty. And I can say from the conversations that I have, both with policymakers and investors, that is the effect, confusion and uncertainty.
I mean, it may well be the case with those tariffs which Trump threatened and then backed down from when both Mexico and Canada basically seemed to calm him by promising solemnly that they would carry on doing things they were doing anyway, that these tariffs were designed to fail, that he never intended to actually impose them. But if he had, is it possible to quantify what the effect would have been on American consumers if those very hefty, as you point out, tariffs had been attached to Mexican and Canadian imports?
This is a very specialized field to assess trade and tariff risk policy, but there are some estimates. First of all, the consumer goods prices for Americans would go up, but also there is recession risk for both Canada and Mexico. And as America's neighbors, they are the most exposed to the US market. But something else is emerging, Andrew, just in the last couple of days that I think was not anticipated by the Trump administration and the advocates of the tariff policy. And that is questions are starting to be asked about whether the rest of the world can decouple from America. Now, that's kind of folly because the US consumer market is the biggest and the richest in the world. But the damage to US soft power and trust in the US as a reliable partner is, I think, an unintended consequence of these policy pronouncements. It's just not a one-way street.
I mean, Trump has always, as a businessman and as a politician, had a very zero-sum approach to any transaction whatsoever. He always thinks there has to be a winner and there has to be a loser, and obviously he always sells himself as the winner, even if he very often isn't. Is that a common line of thinking anymore among people who deal with this stuff for a living? Because it does seem like a throwback. Well, he said it himself. He harkens back to the late 19th century fairly frequently for some reason when this sort of behaviour was more common. But these are relics of a long bygone past, aren't they?
Well, all of us have grown up in a period of globalization where the costs of consumer goods have been brought down, where living standards have increased. But what Trump is really talking about is the way that he, maybe almost certainly overinterprets trade deficits. And he singles out countries that have a large trade deficit with the United States. Particularly, the bad guys, in his view, are China, Germany, and Vietnam. And Vietnam is involved in a kind of circumventing a lot of trade out of China. Now, being a China hawk was something that the world expected, but being tough on neighboring states and the European Union is not something that was expected. So in boardrooms, in markets around the world, there is great confusion about how to plan for this. And you're starting to see questions being asked about whether companies have prepared for tariff risk. And this, falls into the broader kind of explosion of geopolitical risks.
I want to close on something that President Trump said, I think, during his first term, if memory serves, and I quote, "Trade wars are good and they're easy to win." Would it be fair to characterize that as a minority opinion at this point?
I think a minority of one. I mean, the two periods that he refers to, the late 19th century and President McKinley, who he really seems to admire, because he views that period as being a kind of a golden age in the United States. That period was, preceded a depression. And the same with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which every student of Economics 101 knows about, because the passage of those tariffs preceded the Great Depression. So there is more than a little reason to be worried about the effects of the world's largest economy moving in this direction. And that's why we're going to see a fight back.
And just as a final thought, actually, given that we are talking about trade wars in this episode, and we are talking about Donald Trump's zero-sum approach to thing, a world divided into winners and losers, if you embark on a trade war, how is it possible to tell if you've won it?
Well, I mean, I suppose some of the metrics would include shrinking those trade deficits. And this is why the UK ends up being teacher's pet compared to the rest of Europe. We have a smaller trade deficit with the United States. That means we buy fewer goods. We wouldn't want to say that it might be because we're poorer than other European Union member states, but the measurement is unconventional, to say the least. But another thing to remember about Donald Trump is that he if he doesn't think that he's winning, he'll revoke a policy as soon as he's floated a trial balloon around it.
That was Tina Fordham of Fordham Global Foresight. Thank you, as always, for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. The tariffs proposed by President Trump are very far from the first in US history. The second bill signed by President George Washington back in 1789 stuck 5% on almost all imports into the fledgling nation. And trade has been both a means and a cause of conflict between many other nations, with consequences ranging from the vaguely farcical to the deadly serious. My next guest is the author and historian Alex von Tunzelmann. Alex, I want to go back first of all to 1906 to 1908 or thereabouts and the Habsburg Empire versus Serbia. This is the Pig War. Now, obviously, this sounds inherently amusing because pigs are, frankly, inherently amusing. But this is no small change. This one ends up being at least part of a big deal.
It was actually a pretty big deal, yes. I mean, Serbia, then a kingdom, its biggest export was pork. That was basically what you got from Serbia. That's what happened. And pretty much all of it went to Austria-Hungary. And there were a number of issues that came up. One of them was a kind of Austro-Hungarian nationalism. Maybe you should just eat Hungarian pigs, that sort of thing, which is sort of very familiar. But also they became very annoyed that Serbia started getting quite ambitious and building international links to avoid Austro-Hungarian tariffs. So they started, for instance, importing arms from France, making an agreement with Germany on commercial goods, and in 1905, actually creating a customs union with Bulgaria. So all of this kind of reduced the power that Austria-Hungary had over Serbia. So that was kind of the cause of the tariffs that came in.
I mean, there is a lesson here possibly, because it does demonstrate, does it not, that big powers can't always just go and shove small countries around where trade is concerned. I mean, it's not the last time in history, of course, that Austria-Hungary would try to put Serbia back in its place and somewhat misjudge the outcome. But is there a kind of lesson here for those countries, especially those smaller ones, which may be having to adjust to the United States attempting to dictate?
Well, I think there's a very clear lesson from it. So what happened was April 1906, Austria-Hungary just cut off Serb pork imports pretty much entirely. So Serbia actually dug into what it had been doing, increased its relations further, started selling pork to France, Germany and so on. And the way it did that was making an agreement with Bosnia-Herzegovina so that it could use ports for its pork so that it could export via sea to other places in Europe, basically widening its market. And that was the necessity to do it. And actually, if you look at some very dull tables of Serbian exports, you will see that, in fact, Serbian exports rose after this imposition from Austria-Hungary. So what that did was inspire creativity. And I think that is obviously what countries should be doing today if they are subject to tariffs as well.
I mean, is there a happier parallel history of the 20th century in which Austria-Hungary just, sucks it up where Serbian pork is concerned and little more is ever heard of this again and thinks of a way to forge a pleasant and productive relationship with its occasionally truculent smaller neighbour?
Well, the history would be quite different. I mean, the pig wars didn't start World War I, but they were part of the run-up to it. I mean, I think in a sense that probably would have happened anyway because they were more of a symptom than a cause. What was happening is that Serbia was getting generally pretty ambitious in the region, and also that Austria-Hungary was being very, shall I say, pig-headed and not actually prepared to tolerate kind of independent states around its borders. So it annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908. The Serbs tried to get Russia involved. Russia had no appetite for a war with Austria-Hungary at that stage, so they didn't. And then you see this huge instability happening from kind of 1912, a Balkan War where Serbia, Greece and Bulgaria attacked Turkey. Bulgaria then attacks Serbia, but Serbia wins, becomes kind of the most powerful, nation in the Balkans, really, starts to dominate that region. The Austro-Hungarians get the idea that they want to invade Serbia. They keep trying to persuade the Italians to do it, I think something like 25 times. And 1914, of course, this kind of tension culminates in the Archduke Franz Ferdinand being assassinated. Gavrilo Princip was a Bosnian Serb and committed to the cause of young Bosnia. So it's not coming from the pig wars. The pig wars is a step in that story, but it is part of that build-up for sure.
We will move along now to another trade dispute with an equally amusing name because chickens are also inherently amusing. In fact, most barnyard animals are when you think about it. This is the chicken war, which perhaps has more resonance with the imminent near future of US-Europe relations because this occurred between the United States and Europe during the Cold War, when one might have imagined they were broadly on the same side.
Imagine that. Yes. We've got pigs, we've got chickens, we just need some frogs and we're into the Muppet Show fully here. But yes, this is 1961 to 64. What basically happened is that after the Second World War, chicken had been a great delicacy in Europe. It'd been quite a rare meat, relatively speaking, quite expensive. And the US started to sell large amounts of much cheaper chicken on the European market. And this caused great upset with Dutch, French, and West German farmers complaining that this was happening. Some rumors spreading in Germany that American chicken was defective and had been fattened on arsenic, was going to kill people. This might all sound quite familiar to sort of discussions of chlorinated chicken today. And it kind of led to the establishment of the Common Agricultural Policy in 1962, which set minimum import prices for chicken. This caused a pretty big fall off in the imports of American chicken. The US accused the common market of unfair restrictions. And basically this led to 18 months of diplomacy, which actually completely failed. It's sort of extraordinary that you look at the letters from the time and, there's all this discussion about Cuba and Laos and these massive things happening and chicken. Chicken is just a huge deal and part of this. So Lyndon Johnson imposed a 25% tariff on some European imports as a kind of retaliatory measure, potato starch, dextrin and light trucks. And actually, the light trucks tariff is still in place, I think. It certainly was until very recently, partly because Detroit auto manufacturers liked the fact after 1964, even after this was effectively concluded, that they were not able to receive such cheap imports from Asia that, of course, would have challenged their market dominance in the US. So actually, still light trucks are tariffed in the US.
Is that because tariffs often are, quite deliberately symbolic? Everybody knows they're not really doing any economic damage. You're just trying to make a point. The light trucks tariff, how many American farmers were clamoring to buy a Volkswagen pickup anyway?
Well, probably not on that terms, but on broader terms, you could say that that has insulated the American light truck industry from international competition to quite a big extent. Some people would argue that that's held back innovation, particularly environmental standards and lower prices of trucks from, in the 70s and 80s, 70s Japan, 80s and 90s China, now obviously India as well. These kind of imports, not all of them are environmentally better. A lot of them are a lot smaller than American trucks, so they may be environmentally better for that reason. So it has made a difference, and the fact it's lasted so long is, of course, interesting to see, and probably has shaped the kind of vehicles Americans have bought and developed themselves.
So is the lesson there for people perhaps on the receiving end of a trade war, and perhaps if they feel small and intimidated and being run roughshod over by a bully, that you just have to want to win it more than they do? This is asymmetrical warfare of a sort.
Exactly. And asymmetrical hard power may matter less than asymmetric commitment, desire, and intent.
Alex von Tunzelmann, author and historian, thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. It's always tempting to depict everything President Donald Trump does or says as disruptive and or outrageous. But what if his trade crusade isn't either of those things, but just a symptom of a much broader retreat from or rejection of the early 21st century ideal of a globalized, connected planet? Well, joining me finally is Elisabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of Goodbye Globalisation, The Return of a Divided World. Elisabeth, from what we've heard from Donald Trump in this term in particular, do you feel like it is part of that backlash that you chronicle in your book, or is this actually something completely different?
It is his undiluted assault on globalization. And I think what's different this time, what we can already tell is different this time compared to last time, is that this time he is making no excuses for also targeting allies. Last time, I think your listeners will recall, it was mostly about Huawei and China and stopping Huawei on national security grounds. And in the book, I outlined the story, because what turned out to be the case is that even though the Trump administration made the case that they were targeting Huawei on national security grounds, what was the real background was that they needed to an iconic company to target. And yes, there were national security concerns, but this was mostly about correcting the ills of globalization that had seen, from Trump's perspective, had seen foreign countries take advantage of America. And what we're seeing now is his first term magnified several times. So now it's not just about companies that may pose some sort of national security threat. It's about the entire economies of Canada, Mexico, China, and possibly the European Union. And who knows where else he will take us. He just doesn't like globalized business. And he doesn't even like very much trans-border business, because it's the globalized business, you can say, it was never going to work to perfection, but you can still trade with friends and allies. But now he's even targeting America's friends and allies.
Does it surprise you that it should be the United States, which was, of course, and really not all that long ago, the great engine of globalization, should be leading the backlash? And it is at that point worth remembering that Trump isn't doing this on his own. Many millions of his fellow American citizens who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of globalization voted for him to do this.
They voted for him to do this, and they were the beneficiaries of globalization, but they didn't realize just how much they were the beneficiaries of globalization. And what they saw instead was the disadvantages of globalization. They saw jobs disappear. They saw cheaper goods arrive from other countries. And they thought, well, what is this doing for me? It's just enriching various companies that are based far away, and it's all decided by powerful people who are not located in my hometown. And what they didn't see was that the products they were buying, they were consuming, had become much cheaper as a result of globalization. As a result of that, they were able to have a a much more comfortable life. And I shudder to think how much, for example, iPhones would cost if they were all made at home in our Western countries. But that's not what his voters saw. They saw decisions made far away by elites that didn't listen to them, and they were willing to risk a trade war to make that point against the rest of the world, and not just point that assault against the rest of the world.
I mean, when you think back on this period of globalization and its retreat, and this, to reiterate, is all stuff which has happened really pretty recently, is there a moment which strikes you in retrospect as peak globalization, that was as good as it got, if indeed you think globalization is good, and it's all been downhill ever since?
There was a moment of peak globalization, and that was the Beijing Olympics. And the Beijing Olympics took place under the motto of one world, one dream. And it really was one world, one dream. Countries were getting along. They had become incredibly prosperous. Both the ones that had started out relatively or very prosperous, like Western Europe and North America, and ones that had started out significantly less prosperous or even poor, like China and countries in Central and Eastern Europe. They were all prospering as a result of globalization. They were all getting along. And the only people anybody hated at that point were American bankers and subprime mortgage companies that had caused the global financial crisis. But the rest were all getting along, and it hasn't been that good ever since, and it probably won't be for a very long time.
I mean, by identifying the Beijing Olympics as the peak, of course, you're pinning it to 2008, which is also the beginning, as you alluded to, of the global financial crisis which began that year. But if that was the reason for the backlash against globalization, the kind of angst and anger that global financial crisis prompted, is that entirely fair on globalization? Because was that actually a product of globalization in any respect, or was that just an American domestic difficulty that went global?
The global financial crisis definitely didn't cause globalization to stumble. And in fact, I think it united the rest of the world in hating bankers and subprime mortgage lenders. But what happened soon after the Beijing Olympics was that China became more assertive, Russia became more assertive. And at home in our Western countries, citizens started saying, well, hang on, why is the elite not listening to me? So we had this we had a growing unhappiness with the global order coming from completely different directions. And on top of that, you had Chinese leaders and officials saying, well, hang on, how can it be that some irresponsible American bankers and subprime mortgage lenders caused the global economy to stumble? That is not advantageous for us. We will try to reduce our exposure to that American-led global financial system, and they became much more apprehensive about the US-led global financial system, which is, of course, part of globalization. They became much more apprehensive of it as a result of that really unfortunate and shameful financial crisis that was caused really primarily by operators in America.
So just as a final thought then, if we are now firmly in the twilight of globalization, and that is, of course, said with all due acknowledgement that President Trump could change his mind next week and become a militant free trader, is it necessarily a bad thing if the world has retreated somewhat from that peak of globalization? Because things were lost along the way.
Things were lost along the way, and globalization was also built on an illusion, and that illusion was that everybody will get along. Globalization only works if every country, and globalization means every country is involved. That is the literal meaning of globalization. It involves the entire globe, and almost every country was involved, bar North Korea and a couple of others. But it only works if every country adheres to the rules to which it has committed, and that's what didn't happen. And it was illusory to think that it would ever happen in the longer term. Countries could pretend to follow the rules and adhere to the rules, but it's illusory to think that that sort of commitment to the common good would be of any sort of permanence. As a result, well, after a while, we realized that countries were systematically undermining globalization, and China foremost among them. But that said, we did have a good run of globalization while it lasted. It created an enormous amount of prosperity. Unfortunately, it also created a great amount of angst and anxiety among those who were harmed as a result of globalization. We shouldn't forget that globalization's benefits are pretty evenly spread. Business leaders maybe benefit more than others, but we have all benefited from globalization. But those who have paid the price for it, namely those who lost their jobs, paid and suffered acutely as a result of it.
Elisabeth Braw, author of Goodbye Globalisation, The Return of a Divided World. Thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.